Hello everybody. I'm out for a morning walk and there may be a little mic noise and a little traffic noise, but we'll do our best. So all of our models, I was just listening to a Lex Fridman podcast on free will, and forgive me for not recalling the name of his guest, a woman researcher. And they began to talk about suffering. And the researcher posited that suffering and memory are inextricably intertwined. And this is interesting. And their conversation's interesting even though I have problems with various parts of it. But I want to pose a very fundamental question. Are minds distinct? And if so, to what degree? Are they explicitly distinct, the way we pretend they are, by pretending that my mind is known only to me inside my skin? And this is a clinical perspective from a certain angle, but it's also a philosophical perspective, which means it's a perspective that exists only if we admit certain assumptions or axioms. And if we validate those axioms, then the resulting model in our thought creates a boundary somewhere, maybe at the surface of the skin, maybe beyond that slightly, maybe within that slightly, at which the local mind is expected to cease, right? Doesn't pass that boundary. And everything about my human experience and the experience that I have of being more than human, which frankly is most of my experience, because if I had to accept only the definitions of my humanity as they are commonly proposed and promulgated and scripted in culture, I would be a much more limited being than I have experience of being. Of course, this depends on our definition of human and how broad or narrow it is, and in what ways it is broad or narrow. But I've always felt that the definitions are extremely primitive, and they're primitive in bizarre ways that have advanced in their primitivity as our technologies have advanced. In other words, as we've become a more technological species, our ideas about what it means to be human have dwindled to some very limiting and confused perspectives. So first I'm going to argue that most of what we are is more than merely human. A common argument for this, if we're going to be somewhat scientific, is that approximately half of our cells are bacterial, and those cells don't come from our human gene line, which means at least half of our body, human though it appears at the boundary, is within itself not human. We could imagine that bacterial hyperstructures are less than human, but that seems unlikely since we can't be human without them. But let's think about minds. Is there any such thing as a mind that we could call human that exists and develops in isolation? No such things. There are precisely 0 entirely isolated organisms. At the very least, they are connected by belonging to the biosphere in the same way that sets and members are connected, and in a way I would argue that resembles how organs and bodies are connected. And I think the idea of connection is actually backwards. Organisms appear to form vast relational hyperstructures over time, first and foremost, and in comparison, their apparent individuality can be seen as relatively trivial, and it is useful to see it as relatively trivial. So, it looks to me like the opposite of what we think is more like what's going on, and maybe dramatically more like what's going on. You can see that in our technologies we keep attempting to build representations of connections as if we're trying to fill in a space that has been imagined to be missing but never was, empty of signals, relationships, developmental opportunism, negentropy, and all kinds of important things, many of which we don't even have concepts for, let alone words about. And this seems to be a tragic feature of our modernity to me, that we think and believe as if minds are fundamentally separate. And we treat them as separate and think that we are connecting them with signals across wires. Now, it's not untrue, but what I'm proposing is that before we had the wires, we had better connections. Before we had radio, we had something like telepathy. Before we had telephones, we had something like telepathy. And it was much more common in our experience precisely because there were no representations, no mechanical representations of this intrinsic, symbiotic union of all beings in all of time and various smaller cohorts, the beings in present time with us on Earth now, and so on. To as small a cohort as we'd like, 2 people. We don't develop technologies out of thin air the way that we imagine this process to occur. Often, what happens is a relational, behavioral, biological, and perhaps even transcendental situation is replaced by a representation of it, so that we get television as a replacement for group dreaming. I'm going to take a brief break here, and I will return shortly when my errand has proceeded a bit. Our intuitions about the distinctness, the separateness of organisms and minds don't come to us from nature, they come to us from culture, language, concept, ideology. And some people will say, of course anyone can say anything, but some people will say, well, there's no proof that there's something resembling telepathy. And that may or may not be true depending on what the standards of proof are and what the experiments that were performed are, who performed them, what they were looking for, and so on. I've certainly had direct experience of things, events, situations that cannot be other than telepathic, or rather, again, I think we've started the whole game from the wrong side of concern and perception. I think we have minds because there are billions of organisms on Earth that create a field effect in which minds naturally arise as an emergent property of the field of biology on Earth. And that field may have elements that are engaged in time in non-linear ways. Thus, it is possible to know something of the future And this is true even in our representational behavior, concern, and so on. We call the clinical concern with futures different kinds of things in different contexts. Physics will tell us, the application of physics will tell us something of what to expect if a ball is thrown. And for more complex futures, we have the study of probabilities, which very strangely, and I think importantly, can tell us fascinating and useful things about cohorts or groups, but very little, if anything, useful about what we think of as individuals. What if there are no individuals? There's certainly no example of an absolute individual. All of the forms of life we see, every instance of a mind that we will ever encounter, is an emergent embodiment and enaction of characteristics hidden deep in not merely the relationships of the moment, but the entire history of life on Earth. You can imagine that every organism that we can discern as distinct is a thread. And if we follow that thread back to its proximal origin, its most proximal origin, we will find either a progenitor, a pair of progenitors, or a group of progenitors. And so you can see that, with very few exceptions, there aren't any organisms that are alone, that emerge alone, live and die alone. And in fact, in order to be clinical about biology and organisms, we have to work very hard to separate out all the other relationships so that we can control for them, in order to learn something very mechanically specific about a given form of organism, a specific organism, or a cohort of them. Now, some people might be inclined to dismiss my anecdotal propositions, or even declarations, that telepathy actually underlies just about everything. But even if there's all kinds of problems here that we don't ordinarily consider. One of them is how organisms hitchhike on each other and synchronize together to spread the benefit of effort, work done, so on, so that in a wing of Canadian geese, each bird is supported by the other birds, and they switch positions within the wing according to a vast array of variables that are all relational variables, and they're variables of sensing, of group behavior, of symbiotic behavior. And so, again, I think it's backwards to start at the individual and then try to figure out if it's connected to other things, other beings, other minds. Without other minds, there are no minds, right? All of our minds arose in a field of highly structured human behavior, much of which is representational, but not all of which is formally representational. I think our ideas about the supernatural are wrong, but they're not wrong because nothing like these ideas exists. They're wrong because they're too simplistic. The idea of telepathy, for example, begins with the proposition that minds are fundamentally separate, and don't ordinarily connect except along those signal paths that we have already discovered, delineated, described, and are aware of. That's not possibly true. It's not possible for that to be true. That would suppose that we had discovered all the ways that minds connect to each other. That will never happen. That's an impossible goal. So it's certainly a fact that the limited ideas that we have about connection are false to facts in nature. So what I'm proposing here is that we've really got the entire idea quite backwards, that the nature of life on Earth is fundamentally transcendent. It's more than sentient, and not in some AI-funded way, in a biorelational, in a vast manifold of biorelational ways that have been busy being themselves for as long as there's been life on Earth, and probably before that. And this brings us to the question of, what's the nature of time-space? And we ask questions like, well, could the universe be conscious? But what if the universe is something transcendental to consciousness that produces consciousness as a mere side effect of its activities in these domains that we have yet to form intelligent ideas around? And I would say that this is by far the more likely situation. The human concern with utility and with mechanization and automation blinds us to most of what's going on that can't be captured that way. Now, I have had experiences where I know for a fact that my mind was touching a distant mind without any ordinary signaling apparatus operating between us. As an example, at the moment of my grandmother's death, I had an elaborate dream involving her, a musical dream, a beautiful dream. And there was nothing connecting us except the fact that my mother's body was an organ in her body long ago, before it became a distinct, quote, individual in the world. And so too my body and my mother's body, and so on. We're missing out on the vast library of features that biology clearly is engaged in producing, sustaining, developing, transforming over time. And part of the reason we're confused in general is because we have the wrong idea about separation. We think that separation means something resembling explicitly distinctness. And there's no example of this anywhere in nature. This is a clinical idea, an idea, a fiction of the laboratory, a fable of the researcher, but it's the wrong fable. It doesn't resemble life, it resembles machines. And machines don't resemble life. Their relationship with time is entirely, bizarrely flat compared to the nature of organisms in their natural sort of meta-symphony of relation over time. And this leads me back to where I was before, when I was beginning to say that I think we're very confused about the nature of time in general. Certainly that it resembles anything like our models is mostly wrong, except in contexts where it's appropriate. And there are some contexts like that. The staggering vista, the frontier for human knowledge and intelligence is not space-time or machines. Obviously, it's consciousness and awareness. It's the nature of minds and their origins, but it's also things that we have failed to be bold enough to imagine about what's really going on around here, inside our own bodies, in our relationships, and in consciousness. And most of what's going on for a lot of us is heavily scripted. It's scripted by our cultures, our societies, our languages, the concepts they include, and the root concepts they exclude, or that never arose within them, or that were snuffed out by utilitarian concerns. I've had many experiences that made obvious to me that our explanations and ideas about what it means to be human or have a mind, or if minds are separate, are wrong. And I think they're mostly backwards. If we lived in societies where these things were deeply explored, not superstitiously, not as a religion, but directly inquired into together with and for each other, an astonishing universe of other intelligences, other forms of intelligences and modes of intelligences, disembodied intelligences, and so on, would naturally appear directly to our experience, not merely to our ideas and thoughts. Think with me for a moment about the unimaginable complexity of a single second if we draw the boundary just at the atmosphere of Earth. Think with me of the complexity of the signals and transformations that simply occur only in the viral population of this world, a population whose numbers are nearly incalculable, though we could perhaps, posit some exponential number that represents that population. Think of time at the scale of a virus. Think of the trillions of viruses in a single body, and then extend that to the entire planet. The network of viral intelligence on Earth so vastly supersedes anything that we can imagine or encompass that it absolutely dwarfs the entire history of human knowledge. Why would we believe knowledge? Why would we believe our beliefs in the face of something so staggeringly beyond the wildest science fiction, which the natural world actually is, always, and never isn't? How did we become so confused by our capacity to name and model and analyze very small features of the vast universe, the infinite universes within universes that biology naturally comprises, composes, enacts, and embodies? And this is if we take, I'm speaking as if merely the physical layer is the only thing that's going on, but that also cannot be true because, again, even if we take the physical layer, what we know of its qualities is unimaginably limited compared to the actual qualities that exist there. In fact, in a single living organism, there are infinite qualities. In a biosphere of trillions of organisms, there are layered infinities of qualities that can never be encompassed by thought, belief, or knowledge. So why do we believe our thought, belief, and knowledge? I think one of the primary reasons is that it works in a utilitarian sense. We can accomplish goals. Many of those goals have to do with skipping time or changing temporality. The computer, the oven, the refrigerator, these objects all specifically transform time. The refrigerator slows it down by slowing down the number of molecular transformations per second and the biological transformations per second in bacteria and so on. This is why we refrigerate our food. essentially, primarily, to both preserve it over time and to keep it from becoming highly bacteriologically active. So cold inhibits biotime, and warmth generally tends to accelerate it. This whole time-skipping agenda makes certain features of our behavior and mechanical ability appear very compelling and profound, but compared to the simplest organism, they are trivial. We believe them because our common human experience is woven through with utilitarian goals, the goals of commodification, representations, transmission and exchange of commodity and representation. But where do these commodities come from? They come from living beings. There's no place else to get them from around here. We might argue that, well, gold isn't the result of living beings, but the commodification of gold is the result of living beings. Without living beings, gold is perhaps no more or less intrinsically valuable, at least not to humans, than any other substance. It does, however, seem that the material complexity of the living world is a crucial feature in producing the robust expressions of organismal symbiosis, relation, development, conservation over time, and so on, that we're familiar with. Or rather, or are we? Are we familiar with it? To what degree are we familiar with it? And which portions of it acquire our attention, awareness, concern, and purposive behavior? Part of what I'm trying to argue here is a strange argument proposed by a scientist friend of mine, Dr. Kevin Baru, who said that two different things, right? The first thing he said is, if we're going to just make shit up, well, then we can just make up anything, and I don't feel like that's useful or meaningful. And that's a very abrupt sort of comment. But he goes on to say, metaphysics are largely uninteresting to me because the actual complexity of physical reality makes them look silly in comparison. And I think there's something to that argument. What's actually going on, the nature of time-space and organisms and symbiosis in time-space, is so astonishing that humans have failed to conceive of anything resembling it. And we are continually forging new kinds of mechanical, electronic, and conceptual representations, which is a pretty strange behavior for a biological creature, for the simple reason that that behavior begins to compete directly, not merely against the minds that engage in it, but against the history and future of life on Earth. And yes, it's possible to damage the history of life. What we as a species do in this moment changes the meaning of the history of all of the living beings on Earth, and it certainly changes the meaning of human history. If we do something profoundly, amazingly beautiful, that transforms the meaning of suffering that has been endured in previous time. Similarly, if we do something so catastrophically ignorant that it casts a pall on life on Earth, or becomes something that we should surely be deeply ashamed of having done, then similarly we have changed both the history, the meaning of that history, and the meaning of the future, at least for ourselves, but certainly for other creatures as well. Around here, it looks to me like there's one family, and the family has transcendental origins, and by that I just simply mean origins far beyond our capacity to imagine, model, or consider at present, but not beyond our capacity to participate in. And this is the key thing I'm trying to get across. We are missing out on most of the potentials of our nature as organisms, as beings, as consciousnesses, awarenesses, and as families of life, traveling together and doing something incredibly important together that certainly isn't the production of objects for grocery stores or electronic objects to populate machines endlessly. You know, if we love each other, if we love life, if we love nature, if we love time-space, if we love our children, we must explore this frontier and free them of the incredibly cruel and arbitrary limitations that our common conceptions impose on us. Yes, there's the danger of madness, there's the danger of religion, there's the danger, but we face all these dangers anyway. If our systems of thought are so primitive or crude that they largely exclude us from our own innate nature and abilities, then we must agree that they have failed to be anything resembling intelligence. And if we agree that they have failed, then we must establish new frontiers with which we can recover direct experience and understanding of the features of nature, organisms, and humans that don't fit in the models we've become accustomed to obey. I imagine the possibility of a radical and sudden transformation in the entire network of human minds. A transformation catalyzed by a small group of people who simply discover together a few compelling features of our nature that have been blatantly ignored, glossed over, weaponized in religion or for the sake of technology, and so on. And this gives me hope. It's a dire moment for life on Earth right now. It's an incredibly dire moment for the humans. We have, you know, it's funny, as a species, it's really as if we're possessed by demons or something. There's nothing that resembles intelligence at the species level of our species. Our societies and corporations, our nations, are staggering absurdities that have nothing to do with what's going on Earth, the nature of organisms, the nature of consciousness or awareness, except perhaps as sort of the kinds of strange diseases that we might see on display at some freak show. If there are other intelligences in the universe, if they visited Earth, they must either understand intimately the catastrophes that led to the current situation for humans, or they must think there's something fundamentally wrong, right? They're using consciousness, time, awareness, and potential to produce its opposite, and importing entropy, death, and decimation to the biosphere that otherwise is robustly negentropic. I realized the other night as I was thinking through some of these ideas that machines import entropy into the biorelational anatomy of our planet in ways that are dangerous and some of which are completely too invisible to us. We don't imagine, for example, as human beings, that the Earth might be doing something important, something so important that, again, it generates organisms and minds as a mere side effect of this heroic activity it's engaged in, its role in the solar system, in interstellar space, and in time-space itself. We don't imagine that there are different modes of time, but there certainly are. Each object that we see, whether it is a rock or a tree or a bird or a whale or a school of fish or a mountain, each of these features that appear to us visually and conceptually are hiding something so astonishing that the slightest hint of it would obliterate what we think of as knowledge. But instead of seeking for direct experience of and participation in this grand quest that life on Earth is certainly about, our species is busy doing the opposite, right? We're trying to tear all that stuff down and build a bunch of mechanical processes instead, and propagating hundreds of millions of objects and so on. We're directly interfering in whatever it is the Earth is doing. And whatever the Earth is doing, it is doing in concert with the sun, with the sky, with the origins of the universe and the nature of time-space. Each of the forms here, each of the biologies, is a unique mode of temporalities, myriad relational temporalities, in effect, a multidimensional temporal manifold. Each of the organisms we see, each of the natural objects we see, have this quality, but we do not examine this or consider it together. What has happened to so severely blind us? I mean, one of the strangest answers to this question can be drawn from a gloss on the Genesis story. Once you can name things, you can relate with the name, and you can believe that you know the nature of the thing because you have a way of calling it out and distinguishing it from all other things. And this particular capacity and the forms of memory that are associated with this capacity are extremely dangerous. If they develop unchecked, they will lead to an animal not merely capable of tearing down the biosphere, but one that will become furiously compelled to do so in new ways and modes per minute. And that is the position it appears our species is in at the moment, and that position places us directly in conflict with whatever the mission of our world is. And I would suggest that it's not a single mission, it's a symphony of missions bound together in a heroic and very delicate context that is important in ways we've so far failed to imagine. But we can, and I say that we will. And I hope that you and I and others like us will continue the quest and perhaps finally someday form a mission not to Mars, but to the world of our origin, a mission that serves that world and its true natures and purposes in ways as beautiful and intelligent as the nature of biology in time and space bring forth all around us, moment to moment. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to learning again together soon.